The morning air carried the sharp scent of pine and dust from the auction yard, a sprawling compound of chain-link kennels and metal barns on the outskirts of Virginia Beach. For the men gathering in small clusters near the registration tent, the day was routine. They were mostly breeders, private security contractors, and a few sentimental police captains looking to retire a good bomb dog to a quiet home. They spoke in low tones, their boots crunching on the gravel, their eyes scanning the printed catalogs that listed the lots. The items for sale were standard fare: used kennel crates, tactical harnesses, and then the main event, a line of former military and law enforcement canines. These were dogs being decommissioned, sold to the highest bidder like surplus equipment. Among the handlers and vendors, a woman moved with a quiet purpose that did not fit the environment. Her name was Claire Beck. She was tall and slender, dressed not in tactical gear but in a simple gray sweater and jeans, her dark hair pulled back tightly from her face. She carried no catalog. She had no bidder's paddle in her hand. In the pocket of her jeans, her fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the edges, a printed auction notice she had found online 3 weeks ago. The notice mentioned a specific transfer of K-9 personnel from a private contractor who had supplied dogs for overseas contingencies. It was a name on that list that had driven her here, alone, into a world that had been her late husband's, never her own. Her husband, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Beck, had been a Navy SEAL. He had been killed in a training accident 18 months ago, a helicopter crash during a night exercise off the coast. The accident had taken him and 7 other operators, leaving behind a trail of Gold Star families and a single surviving member of his assault element, a Belgian Malinois named Loki. Marcus had loved that dog with a fierce professional pride. He had handled Loki for 3 years, 2 deployments. Loki had cleared buildings, found IEDs, and once, according to the citation Marcus never talked about, had taken the brunt of a close detonation to shield his handler, earning a Purple Heart for the dog that Marcus had hung on his own office wall. After the crash, the Navy had taken Loki back. He was government property, a highly trained asset. Claire had fought for him. She had written letters, made phone calls, begged the commanding officers to let her adopt the only living piece of her husband that remained. The answers were always the same: policy, regulations. The dog still had service life left. They had reassigned Loki to a new handler, a young SEAL she didn't know, and shipped them both to a new squadron. Claire had been left with nothing but Marcus's uniforms in the closet and the ghost of a dog's bark echoing in the empty yard. Now, according to a whisper network of SEAL wives and a single anonymous text message from a source inside the K-9 unit, Loki was here. He was being decommissioned early. The new handler had been injured, and the dog, they said, had become unmanageable. He was aggressive, untrustworthy. He had bitten a kennel master. The decision had been made to cut losses and sell him at public auction. Claire had driven through the night from her small apartment in Norfolk to get here. She didn't know what she was going to do. She had no money for a bidding war. Her savings were depleted by Marcus's funeral and the move. But she had to see him. She had to let Loki know that someone who loved Marcus was here. The auction began in the main barn, a cavernous space with dirt floor and bleachers set up on one side. The auctioneer, a stout man with a booming voice, stood on a wooden platform. The first few lots were equipment. Then came the dogs. They were led in one by one on thick leather leashes by handlers in plain clothes. A German Shepherd, former patrol dog, stood stoically as bids flew. A Labrador, explosives detection, was sold to a man in a cowboy hat for $1,200. Claire watched from the back, her heart pounding against her ribs with each sale. Finally, the auctioneer looked at his clipboard and called out the next lot. Lot 17, military working dog Belgian Malinois, male, 7 years old, former DOD asset. Trained in bite work, apprehension, and explosive detection. Note on file, handler specific, sold as is. 2 handlers appeared from the side door, walking a tight, coiled bundle of tan muscle. Loki. He was thinner than Claire remembered, his ribs faintly visible beneath his short coat. His harness was standard issue, but his eyes were what caught her attention. They were not the bright, eager eyes of the dog who used to sleep on Marcus's feet while they watched TV. They were flat, hard, and scanning the crowd with a predatory stillness. He did not pull on the leash. He moved with a mechanical precision, but his entire body radiated a dangerous tension. The crowd, mostly experienced with dogs, shifted uneasily. This was not a pet. This was a loaded weapon with a hair trigger. "Do I have an opening bid?" the auctioneer called out. $500 for this fine animal. 500. Silence. The handlers stood with Loki, looking bored. A man near the front shook his head. "That dog's a biter," he muttered loudly. "Won't work for nobody new." 400 then, the auctioneer adjusted. $400 for a fully trained war dog. Someone give me 4. Another pause. Claire's mouth was dry. She saw Loki's ear twitch, the only sign that he was processing the sounds, the smells, the stress of the yard. She wanted to call out, to bid, but her voice was frozen. What would she do with him? She lived in a small apartment that didn't allow pets. She worked part-time at a library. She couldn't handle a dog that had bitten a professional handler. A man in the second row, a large man with a shaved head and a thick neck, raised his hand lazily. 200. The auctioneer nodded. I have 200. Do I hear 250? Claire's heart sank. $200. Marcus's partner, his battle buddy, the dog who had saved his life, was being sold for $200 to a man who looked like he ran a security firm, who would chain Loki in a kennel and use him as a guard dog until his teeth wore out. 250, another voice called from the side. The shaved-head man countered. 3. 350. 4. The bids came faster now, climbing to $700. The shaved-head man was determined, but so was a young woman in the back who looked like she might be a trainer. The price hit 900. Claire felt a tear slip down her cheek. She wiped it away angrily. This was a nightmare. She couldn't watch this. As the auctioneer droned on, 900 going once, 900 going twice. Claire took a step forward, not to bid, but to leave. She couldn't bear to see the final gavel fall on Loki's fate. But as she moved, her foot scraped against a loose stone on the dirt floor. The sound was small, insignificant, lost in the noise of the barn. But Loki heard it. His head snapped around so fast the handler holding his leash stumbled. The dog's eyes locked onto Claire. For a long, breathless second, they stared at each other. Claire saw no recognition in those flat eyes. She saw only a trained killer assessing a potential threat. She froze, her heart hammering. The handler yanked the leash. "Sit!" he commanded, his voice harsh. Loki ignored him. He took a step toward Claire, his nose working. The crowd noticed now, a ripple of attention turning from the auctioneer to the dog and the woman in the gray sweater. The handler pulled again, harder. "I said sit, damn it!" The auctioneer paused, annoyed. "Control your animal, please." But Loki was beyond control. He took another step, dragging the handler who was now bracing his feet. The dog's body was tense, but his tail, which had been tucked low, gave a single stiff wag. He whined, a high-pitched, questioning sound that was utterly at odds with his menacing appearance. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Without thinking, without a plan, she spoke. It was just a whisper, a name carried on the dusty air. "Marcus!" The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Loki stopped dead in his tracks. His ears, which had been pinned back, swiveled forward. His entire demeanor shifted. The coiled tension in his muscles didn't relax, but it changed, from the tension of aggression to the tension of desperate hope. He stared at Claire, and then he did something that made the entire auction barn go silent. He sat. Not because he was commanded, but because it was the first thing Marcus had ever taught him. Sit was the foundation of trust. The handler, bewildered, looked down at the dog who had just disobeyed 3 direct commands, now sitting calmly like a puppy in a kindergarten class. "What the—" Claire took a tentative step closer. "Loki," she said softly. "Loki, it's okay." At the sound of his name, spoken in a woman's gentle voice, the dog's hard eyes softened. He whined again, a louder, more insistent sound, and his tail began to wag in earnest, sweeping back and forth across the dirt. He looked from Claire to the handler and back to Claire, as if trying to connect dots that didn't quite line up. She smelled like the house. She smelled like the couch where he used to curl. She smelled like the ghost of Marcus, the scent embedded in the fabric of her clothes. The auctioneer, sensing a disruption to his sale, banged his gavel. 900 to the gentleman in the front! Going once! No! Claire's voice cut through the barn, clear and strong. She was shaking, but she stepped forward until she was at the edge of the ring. Please, I need to see him. The shaved-head man stood up, irritated. Hey, I'm bidding here. Keep the lady out of the ring. The handler tried to pull Loki back, but the dog wouldn't budge. He was staring at Claire, his whole body vibrating with a suppressed joy that was painful to watch. He knew her, not as a handler, but as family. The scent of the home, of the pack, was on her. Claire looked at the auctioneer, her eyes pleading. That dog belonged to my husband. My husband was his handler. He's dead. Please, just let me touch him. A murmur went through the crowd. The auctioneer hesitated, glancing at the event organizer who stood near the platform. The organizer, a retired military vet himself with a gray crew cut, nodded slowly. He had seen this before, the bond between handler and dog. It was sacred. All right, the auctioneer said, waving his hand. 1 minute, but the sale continues. Claire didn't wait for permission to be repeated. She walked into the ring, ignoring the handler's warning look, and knelt in the dirt. Loki strained against the leash, and this time, the handler let him go. The dog crossed the space between them in 2 bounds, but instead of jumping, he stopped inches from her. He sniffed her face, her hair, her hands. Then, with a groan so deep and human it sounded like a sob, he pressed his massive head into her chest and collapsed at her feet, rolling onto his side, exposing his belly in the ultimate sign of submission and trust. His tail thumped a frantic rhythm against the ground. Claire wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his neck. She smelled the familiar scent of dog and dust, and something else, something sharp and metallic that must have been the kennels. But beneath it, faint and fading, she swore she could still smell Marcus. The oil from his skin, the soap he used, the coffee he spilled on his camis. Loki had carried that scent with him, a ghost locked in his fur, for 18 months, and now he had brought it home. The barn was utterly silent except for the dog's whining and the woman's quiet tears. The shaved-head man, the bidders, the handlers, they all stood transfixed by a display of loyalty that transcended training, transcended policy, transcended death itself. The auctioneer cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the raw emotion on display. All right, folks, let's get back to it. We have a sale to finish. The bid is at $900 to the gentleman. Claire looked up, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She looked at the shaved-head man, then at the organizer. I don't have $900, she said, her voice breaking. I have $300 in my savings. But I'll pay anything. I'll work. I'll clean these kennels for a year. Please, you can't sell him. He's all I have left of my husband. The organizer stepped forward, his face unreadable. He looked at the dog, still lying at Claire's feet, utterly at peace for the first time in months. He looked at the woman, a widow, a Gold Star wife, begging for a piece of her past. He turned to the shaved-head man. Sir, I'm going to ask you to withdraw your bid, as a personal favor. The man's face reddened. Like hell I will. I got a contract to fill. I need a dog. The organizer didn't blink. He was a big man, and the years of service were etched in the set of his jaw. That dog is not for you. That dog belongs to her. Look at him. You really want to take that animal away from his person? The man looked at Loki, still wagging, still pressing his head into Claire's lap. He saw a dog that was calm, loving, and utterly useless to him. A dog that would bite him the second he tried to make it work. He cursed under his breath and waved his hand dismissively. Fine, whatever. This auction's a circus anyway. He turned and stalked out of the barn, his boots stomping on the wood. The organizer looked at the crowd. "Anyone else want a bid on this dog?" he asked quietly. There was no sound. He nodded to the auctioneer. "Sell it to the lady for the opening bid. 500. Claire's head shot up. "I told you I only have 3. "Ma'am," the organizer interrupted, his voice gentle now. "I know who your husband was. I served with a guy who knew him. He was a good man. And that's a good dog. The opening bid is 500, but the auction house is donating the difference. You owe us $300. Claire stared at him, speechless. The auctioneer, catching on, banged his gavel without waiting for another word. "Sold! To the lady in the gray sweater for the opening bid. Congratulations, ma'am. You just bought a war hero." The barn erupted in applause. Not the polite clapping of a crowd, but a genuine, heartfelt ovation from men who understood the weight of the moment. Handlers, cops, vets, they all knew what it meant to lose a partner. They all knew what it meant to find one again. Claire sat in the dirt, holding Loki, crying and laughing at the same time. The dog, sensing her joy, licked her face, his tail a blur of motion. He was home. He didn't know how, and he didn't know why the man with the Marcus smell wasn't here. But the woman had the smell, and the woman was here, and that was enough. It took 2 hours to finish the paperwork and pay the fees. The organizer, whose name was Bill, helped her load Loki into the back seat of her old sedan. The dog sat upright, alert, watching the auction yard disappear through the rear window. Claire got in the driver's seat and looked at him in the rearview mirror. "Let's go home, Loki," she said. At the sound of his name, the dog's ears perked, and he leaned forward, resting his heavy head on her shoulder from the back seat. She reached up and scratched his ear, and he let out a contented sigh. The drive back to Norfolk was quiet. Claire's mind was a whirlwind of logistics. The apartment, the landlord, the food bowl she didn't have, the bed she would need to buy. But as she drove, she felt a warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced since the day the Navy officers had knocked on her door. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was something more fundamental. It was connection. When they pulled into the parking lot of her small apartment complex, Loki's tail began to wag. He recognized the building. He recognized the walkway. When Claire opened the back door, he leaped out and trotted directly to the door of apartment 4B, the door he had walked through 100 times before, and sat, waiting for Marcus to open it. Claire's eyes filled with tears again as she walked up with the keys. She opened the door, and Loki walked in like he had never left. He sniffed the furniture, the corners, the kitchen floor. He stopped at a pair of Marcus's boots that Claire had never been able to throw away, lying by the door. He sniffed them long and hard, then lay down next to them, his head on his paws, and looked at Claire as if to say, "Okay, this is right. This is where I belong." That night, Claire slept on the floor next to Loki, her arm draped over his side, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. For the first time in 18 months, the apartment didn't feel empty. The silence wasn't lonely. The ghost in the room had a heartbeat and a warm coat, and he would never leave again. In the weeks that followed, the story of the auction spread through the military community. It was shared in whispered conversations at the commissary, in posts on closed Facebook groups for military families, in a brief article in the base newspaper. People called it a miracle, a sign, a testament to the bond between a warrior and his dog. Claire didn't care what they called it. She was too busy rebuilding her life around a 70-pound Malinois who needed 3 walks a day and still went rigid with alert at the sound of a helicopter overhead. Loki adjusted slowly. He had nightmares, waking up growling in the dark until Claire spoke his name and reminded him where he was. He had rules etched into his soul. No food from the table, no playing in the house, always walk on the left side. But he also learned new things. He learned that the couch was for cuddling. He learned that Claire's lap, though smaller than Marcus's, was just as warm. He learned that the word love was not in his training vocabulary, but he felt it every time she scratched behind his ears and whispered stories about the man who had brought them together. Claire took him to the dog park, where he ignored the other dogs and stayed glued to her side. She took him to the beach, where he discovered the joy of chasing waves and came back covered in sand, looking up at her with a goofy grin that made her laugh out loud. She took him to the cemetery, to the grave where Marcus was buried under a simple white stone. Loki lay down on the grass and didn't move for an hour, his nose pointing toward the headstone, his eyes closed. Claire sat beside him, and they kept vigil together. The auction house sent her the paperwork a week later, officially transferring ownership. On the bottom of the form, someone had handwritten a note. For Marcus Beck, U.S. Navy, fair winds and following seas. We'll take it from here, brother. Claire framed the note and hung it on the wall next to Marcus's seal trident and the purple heart that Loki had earned. It was a strange collection, a medal for a dog, a pin for a man, a note from a stranger, but to Claire, it was a testament. It was proof that love didn't end with death. It just changed shape. It found new ways to survive. And every night when Loki curled at her feet and sighed in his sleep, she knew that Marcus was still with them. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as the invisible thread that had pulled a woman to an auction and a dog to her arms. The seal was gone, but his partner had stepped into the void alone, and together they had found their way home.